as well place this one under the floorboards. Dennis this time even went as far as saying that the sight of Oakenden's body and skin were so beautiful that the sight would almost bring him to tears. So he was very much associating the feeling of love and euphoria and excitement to death at this point. In one source, it even sounded as if Dennis would remove the body from underneath the floorboards in order to carry on a conversation. So even after he had put them underneath the floorboards and stored them there, it sounded like he would even get them out and talk to them and carry on a conversation as if the victim was still alive at that point. His third victim was Martin Duffy. Martin was a homeless 16-year-old who was invited to Dennis's place to stay the night. After his death, an initial time of staying in the bed with Dennis like normal, Duffy would be kept in a wardrobe for 2 weeks before joining Oakenden underneath the floorboards. The next victim was prostitute Billy Sutherland, who was 27, so he was much older than the victims that were prior to this. Malcolm Barlow was also a victim of Dennis Nilsen. He was a 24-year-old orphan with learning disabilities. By the time of his death, Dennis had run out of room to store the bodies and had to stuff him under the kitchen sink. I think that's horrifying. Like, he had literally run out of spots to put dead bodies in his apartment building. By this time, of course, neighbors are noticing the smell and they're complaining about it, but every time they complain, he just claims that it's due to structural problems within the building. By 1981, Dennis had killed approximately 12 men in the apartment, but only these men that I've listed could be positively identified. Dennis would remove his clothing and dismember them on his kitchen floor, while sometimes boiling the skulls to remove the flesh. Then he would remove the organs, since that was the part that was going to smell the worst. And so he would dispose of that in trash bags and then try to dispose of the bodies in other ways. He would bury the limbs in his garden and shed sometimes. He would burn what remains he could in a bonfire outside. There are even accounts of children dancing around a fire outside, and nobody even suspected that there would be human remains being burned in that fire. We can already see how much Dennis loves the feeling of control and power, and how frightened he is of that feeling of loneliness and abandonment, and the feeling of having someone there close with him is the only source of happiness that he's feeling right now at this point. He would later claim that he hated the disposal process. It was just something that had to be done. But he claimed he needed a lot of whiskey to be able to calm his nerves, and he would use handfuls of salt to brush aside maggots in order to actually process the human remains. He usually would pick people that he thought of as being vulnerable, people that wouldn't be easily missed, and that's really evident in the number of victims that have not been identified so far. I'm sure there were people, family members, and everything that were looking for these people, but due to maybe their lifestyles or living in the city, they just weren't able to be located. He also really loved the idea that people needed him, and so he went for people that were younger, more vulnerable, in these positions where they might be portrayed as they need him. In 1982, Dennis, in an effort to maybe stifle his desire to continue killing, he moves into this top floor apartment in North London. It didn't have any garden area or the convenient floorboards like the other flat had provided for him. There were at least 3 more victims that were killed in this new apartment. John Howlett, Archibald Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair were all positively identified as victims from this time period. There are some major obstacles as far as disposing these corpses, so he has to get even crazier with his disposal methods. He ends up boiling the heads, feet, and hands while cutting the bodies into smaller chunks that he could dispose of in plastic bags or flush down the toilet. Now, one thing that comes to my mind when you're boiling an animal skull to get the flesh off of it and to keep the skull, the smell of that skull boiling is vile. So I can't imagine boiling a human head in a home and actually having an apartment building where other people can smell this. I can imagine it smells much the same way. So this had to be such a stench from him even performing this. But he would cut the bodies into those smaller chunks, and he's trying to flush them down the toilet to get rid of these chunks of meat. So in the apartment building, they start having plumbing issues, and their pipes all start to back up. Everything starts to smell horrible, as you can imagine. The neighbors are outraged. They're trying to find a plumber, and they're trying to get a hold of the building manager to at least get somebody in there that can fix this problem. So they do end up getting somebody to come and check the drains in February of 1983. And it's determined that due to where the blockage is, it has to be the very top floor of where the blockage is, because it's coming from the top floor in between the second floor down. And so they narrow it down that it has to be coming from Dennis's apartment that's leading to the issue. So they go down into the manhole and they end up finding rotting human remains that day. And I'm not sure, I cannot tell you why they leave parts in there, go home for the night, and come back, but they do. So that night, Nilsen is fully aware that he's going to be in trouble and his days are getting numbered. He actually attempts to remove some of that human tissue from the drains that night, and at that point, he's spotted by another tenant in the building. And by this point, they're becoming increasingly worried and just suspicious of everything that's going on with Dennis. They pretty much know that something is horribly wrong at that point. So the next day, Dennis goes to work like normal, and as he's leaving from work, he jokingly tells a coworker, quote, "If I'm not in tomorrow, I'll either be ill, dead, or in jail," end quote. That evening, when he returns home from work, a detective is there to talk to him about his latest discovery. The detective lets him know that they're inquiring about the blockage in the drains that's coming from his flat, and Dennis tells him, "Well, that's weird. I didn't realize police were interested in plumbing issues." To which the detective just replies, "Let me in your apartment and I will discuss this matter with you further." So they enter in, and immediately the detectives are able to smell the rotting flesh inside the apartment, and they explain to Dennis that human remains have been the culprit of all of these blockages in the pipes. He replies, quote, "Good grief, how awful," end quote. To which the detective responds, "Don't mess about, where's the rest of the body?" He points them to the wardrobe, where they find trash bags full of body parts. And if you look up online and just Google these are full, huge black trash bags, like lawn trash bags, and they are full of remains that are in these wardrobes that he has just stored there. Dennis is taken to the police station, and on the way, he's asked whether the remains were from one body or two, to which he flatly replied while he was staring out the window, quote, 15 or 16 since 1978, end quote. So, out of all of the attacks from Dennis, there were some survivors that did manage to get out of their terrifying experiences with him. Undoubtedly, the most famous is Carl Stoddard, and he has quite a few interviews that you can go on and take a look at if you're interested in further researching this. But Carl Stoddard was strangled to the point that Nilsen believed he was dead. He would actually later resuscitate him. It happened with at least 3 more victims, but unfortunately, all of the attacks would go unnoticed by authorities. And at the time, this was really in my opinion, just due to them being homosexual. They weren't taken seriously, and they were looked at as having put themselves in a situation that was dangerous, and they were not going to really take it seriously. And so it's a shame that not more was done when this happened to these people. After getting Carl that night extremely intoxicated, Dennis had attempted to put him to bed in a sleeping bag, and he's telling him, "Don't worry, I'll take care of you. Let me put you in this sleeping bag. Just be careful not to smother yourself in it." So at some point, he gets him in the sleeping bag, and he ends up trying to strangle him with the string on the sleeping bag. He then drowns him just like he did the other victims. And Carl at that point is fighting for his life. But Dennis pretty much assumes that he's overcome him when he passes out. And Dennis goes through the whole ritual all over again of cleaning the body and everything and making sure that he's lying down. And Carl eventually actually awakes to Dennis's dog licking his face. Upon realizing that he's still alive, Dennis attempts, like I said, to pass off the entire encounter as if he had maybe saved Carl from a near-death experience. He had resuscitated him and brought him back, and he was kind of the savior of the whole incident. Carl was really fuzzy on the incidents of that day, and he didn't really realize until quite a while later that he had actually survived a murder attempt. And when he finally does realize that, it kind of all comes flooding back to him at once, that he remembers being smothered, and he remembers Dennis and fighting against Dennis, and Dennis actually fighting him to keep him underneath the water and everything. At one point, Carl actually does end up coming back and testifying in Dennis's trial, and that was helpful in order to get that perspective there of somebody who had survived an attack. Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, it doesn't seem like he had the easiest time. There was one attack where he was cut on the face and chest by a fellow inmate, which required 89 stitches. After that, security was increased, and he was a bit more secluded from his fellow inmates. I can't imagine that he liked the idea of the loneliness and seclusion anymore either. Dennis would later die in excruciating pain after having ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Dennis would later die in excruciating pain after having a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. So that is the story of Dennis Nilsen in a nutshell. It's a very high overview of Dennis Nilsen and a lot of his crimes. Like I said, not all of the victims have been identified fully, and there's a lot of reason for that. But maybe in the coming years, as technology advances, who knows what they can be capable of finding. Before we go tonight, I have one story to read to you. Here locally, the YWCA is actually hosting a 2021 Wyoming State Silent Witness Ceremony, and they are encouraging individuals to spread awareness, educate themselves, and remember those who have lost their life because of domestic violence. And so I thought I would read you the story of one of those young ladies, and it's just such a touching story, but horribly sad, and at the same time very empowering, because it's something that we can learn from, and hopefully through her life she can be remembered and her family can be honored, and some good can come out of it. So here is the story of Whitney Nicole. In the early morning hours of December 16th, 2019, Hunter Sewell maliciously took his wife Whitney's life along with their unborn child. He instilled fear in her by chasing her throughout their home and shooting 4 random shots at her. After terrorizing her, he cornered her in their kitchen and shot her twice, point blank in the head. Being the coward he was, he later took his own life using the same gun he killed Whitney with. Whitney Nicole was born on January 27,